Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our stream with Professor Richard Wolff. We are absolutely thrilled to have him here. If you watch this channel regularly, you probably know who he is, but if you're new here or maybe if you're just unfamiliar, Richard D. Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School, University NYC. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and host of their nationally syndicated show Economic Update. His latest book is The System is the Sickness: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. And it's available with his other books, Understanding Socialism and Understanding Marxism, at www.democracyatwork.info. So I highly encourage everyone to check out the Democracy at Work YouTube channel and also Richard Wolff's personal YouTube channel, because he does a really, really great job making all of this incredibly important and incredibly complex economic information accessible to a really wide audience. So Richard, thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled to have you on the show. My
pleasure, Mexie, and thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to dive into the questions. We have a number of questions that we solicited from Facebook and Twitter and that I came up with myself. And then if we have any time at the end, we will field some questions from the chat. I just want to say thank you, Scalisi, for the super chat. We may have time to get to that later. But starting off, capitalism, as you know, especially late stage capitalism in this finance capitalist era, is incredibly volatile and it's prone to crisis. You've said many times that capitalism has actually crashed 3 times in the past 20 years. So I'm wondering, experts are fearing that we're headed for a recession that will rival the Great Depression. So where do you think we are right now? How does our current moment compare to the Great Depression in terms of employment, housing, and food security? And where do you see things heading in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay, let me answer this way. This is the worst crash of American capitalism since the Great Depression. So that means everybody watching, listening to this program, this is the worst economic crash in our lifetimes, all of us. It is a profound testimony to the fundamental instability of the capitalist system. If you look at the history of capitalism, both in the United States and anywhere else in the world where it has settled, it has an economic downturn. And by the way, many words for it: recession, depression, bust, crash. I mean, the language is full of it. Why? Because it happens on average every 4 to 7 years. That is for centuries. Everything has been tried in capitalism to get rid of this instability because the capitalists, the people who like capitalism, always understood correctly that a system that crashes like this every 4 to 7 years, throwing millions of people out of work, destroying businesses, interrupting or destroying educations, breaking up families, this disaster happening every 4 to 7 years is hardly a recommendation for the system. And so they really did try, using their best minds to figure out a way to stop it from happening. Give you an example. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the president then, Franklin Roosevelt, went on the radio and gave a famous speech. And in the speech, he said, I have some plans for how to get us out of this depression. And I want you to support me. And I promise you in exchange that these measures that I'm proposing will not only get us out of this depression, but will prevent us from having more depressions so that our children will not suffer this kind of collapse of the economy the way we are. Roosevelt promised it, and every president since has promised it. But no president has ever been able to deliver on the promise. The promise has been betrayed. And we are now in the biggest betrayal since the Great Depression. The unemployment rates we have now are Depression-era unemployment rates. The collapse of production, likewise. But let me review the 3 that we've had in our new century, because in a way they illustrate the point. Early in the spring of 2000, we had a crash of our economy. We called it the dot-com crash. Why? Because the prices of shares of dot-com companies had gone through the roof in the stock market. Now, you didn't have to be a genius to understand that prices of shares go through the roof from time to time without causing a crash. So blaming it on the prices didn't make too much sense, but it was very helpful to distract people from asking the obvious question, why is this system crashing again, having been told that we had learned from the earlier crashes how to avoid it? Didn't work. We had a crash. 7 years later, in 2008, we had another crash. The only difference was it had a different name. It was called the subprime mortgage crash. Again, blaming the trigger rather than the system that's unstable. It was worse than the one in 2000. And here we are in the year 2020. Boom, we got the third one of this century, and this one we're going to be calling the COVID-19 crash or something like that. Once again, blaming the trigger that happens just at the same time rather than the system. 20 years of a new century, 3 crashes, works out to a little under 7 years. Bingo, just what we would expect. And most people knew that this crash was coming and predicted it long before we knew anything about the virus and what it would do. So for me, I see this as the worst crash of the 3. That's not a good sign. Mm-hmm. It shows us that the measures taken after 2000 didn't prevent or reduce the awfulness of the one in 2008. And now again, only more so since 2008 to this one. Mm-hmm. We have the pandemic, which no doubt makes it much worse. This is a system that seems to me to, and let me stop with that, to have failed. I mean, there's no nice way to say this. Mm-hmm. You know, viruses have been with us from day one. It's part of nature. Viruses are things in nature that can be very toxic to plants, to animals, to people. We had a terrible one 100 years ago in 1918, very famous. Mm-hmm. People know about it. We've had more recent ones, MERS, SARS, Ebola. I mean, we know, and we should have been prepared. What in the world is wrong with a system that didn't prepare mm-hmm. for what we knew was coming? Sort mm-hmm. of the same question that the fires in the West Coast are making us we knew what was mm-hmm. coming, and here we are with mm-hmm. our fingers in our noses because we haven't gotten ready, and now we're not containing it. Mm-hmm. The United States is a rich capitalist country. We have 4.5% of the population of the world and over 20% of the COVID cases and the COVID deaths. Mm-hmm. That failure of a system. Mm-hmm. Last point, why do I keep saying it's a failure of this system? Here's the way to make it really clear. I understand that no capitalist company of the kind that might produce tests or masks or ventilators or hospital beds, they're not going to produce those beds, store them in a warehouse somewhere, make sure they stay, in good shape for an indefinite amount of time before they can sell it. They're not going to do that because it isn't profitable. And capitalism says to the company, you do what's profitable and you avoid what isn't. So they don't produce those things. Okay, we all understand that. The government then can compensate for the failure of private capitalism to manage this situation. By the way, this situation is called public health and is a fundamental need of human beings. So private capitalism stinks at taking care of public health for the reasons we all understand. Well, the government could come in and, the government could buy up tests, masks, ventilators, ICU units, all the rest of it, and store them around the country and make sure they stay in good shape, replace them if they wear out, blah, 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 blah. We know the government can do it because that's what it does with military equipment. It doesn't pay a company to produce a tank or a machine gun or an airplane. So the government comes in, buys all that stuff, making a nice profit for the companies that produce them. And then the government, at its own expense, that is you and me, pay for storing it and locating it around the country for a military emergency. But our government didn't do that for a medical emergency. So we were unprepared. And we are now paying the price, 200,000 nearly dead. I mean, it's unspeakable what's going on. The failure is catastrophic. I don't think I have to explain to people that we can do better than capitalism. We're living through the proof of it.
Yes, absolutely. That was incredibly well said. So you mentioned, what the government could have done that they're not doing. At the beginning of this crisis, I actually thought that this could really, really shake up. This could be the end of capitalism as we know it, because I wrongfully assumed that the ruling class, the politicians, they would be forced to make some concessions. They would be forced to provide debt relief, rent relief, maybe even basic income, if only to avoid the inevitable unrest and the possible radicalization of the masses. However, they've only provided $1,200 so far, and now millions of Americans stand to become homeless on January 1st. Why do you think the bourgeoisie is taking such an incredible risk? And do you really think they're going to just let this happen?
That's a wonderful question. And, I'd put it almost this way. In the history of the collapse of empires, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, when the historians go back, they look at the years, and sometimes we're talking decades, before the thing collapses, and they say to themselves as they look at the history, how could these people not have seen what was coming down the pike at them? Why in the world didn't they do this or that, which seems, with our 2020 hindsight, to be the obvious thing you should have done? We have it even worse now, because what the United States did is much worse in terms of the risk the bourgeoisie is taking than they did in Germany. I mean, or Europe. Let me give you an example. Before the pandemic hits Germany, unemployment was 5%. Over the summer, unemployment in Germany rose to 6%. In other words, very little. We went from 4.5% to 20%. I mean, it's a spectacular difference. Why? Because in Germany, it was understood that had the government thrown millions of people out of work, allowed that to happen, those millions of people would have left their job and gone right into the street, and Germany would have come to a halt. They know that. And it's true in France and Italy, and you fill in the blank, right? They couldn't. Here in the United States, it's a different situation. They can, and they think they can go quite a bit further. And they think that because for the last 25 years, they've been going further, bit by bit, leading people like you and me to ask exactly your question. How in the world do they dare do that? And the answer is they were worried, but they saw there was no apparent cost. Now, it's still a risk. You're still right to wonder because, nothing may be happening, but under the surface, who knows? Let me be very concrete. We have a labor movement, the AFL-CIO, right? It is the dominating labor movement of this country. We have the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Has the labor movement called for a demonstration? No. Has it brought people into the streets? No. Has it raised hell in 27 different ways? No. So the people who say, we gave the unemployed an extra $600. The Republicans are now proposing to reduce it to $300. Why should they give $600? Make the mass of people desperate. It seems that you can kick them and they don't kick back. And therefore, and they're scared, by the way, I don't want to leave the wrong impression. The people running this society know how bad it is, and they're very worried. They're borrowing money. We have a $3 trillion debt this year in the budget. We never had that before, except in World War II, and even then, not this big. They're very worried that as these debts accumulate, the American people are going to have political leaders who are going to say, gee, if the debt is so high and that's costing us so much, let's reduce the debt. And here's a way to do it. We can tax corporations and the rich, pay back the people the government borrowed from, and then we'll all be better off, and the rich will still be rich. They just won't be obscenely rich. The obscenely rich understand this very well. They want to keep this from getting to that point. So it's interesting for them to reduce what we give to unemployed people from 600 to 300. That way they slow and postpone the day when all of this comes due. So that's why they do it, and they think they can get away with it. By the way, all those empires fell because they kept doing it. And then they did it the last time when it turns out you couldn't get away with it.
Yeah.
And my suspicion is we may be very well down that path. That, yes, the United States doesn't push back. The Americans don't. But when they finally do, watch out.
Right. Yeah, I feel like they're just counting on our ignorance of the situation, basically, and our ignorance of political economy in general, and just seeing how far they can go, because they can't, if they did those things, if they did give debt relief and all of those things, it would be kind of admitting that the whole ethos of American and Americana is wrong, right?
Absolutely. I mean, here's a wonderful way to capture that. If you look around, you will notice that in recent months, conservative people, right-wing people, the people who used to attack welfare moms, single mothers with children who had to take care of the kids and couldn't go to work and therefore went on the dole or went on welfare and got welfare payments, were being attacked as lazy or criminal or all the rest of it. You don't hear that. You don't hear it. And the reason you don't hear it, I'm convinced, is because welfare is how everybody now lives. Let me give you just two examples. 1/3 of all mortgages in the United States are now owned by the Federal Reserve System of this country. In other words, here's how it works. Mr. and Mrs. Smith go to the bank to borrow money to buy a house. Mr. and Mrs. Smith borrow the money, and they write an IOU. It's called a mortgage. They owe the bank X dollars, and they pay it off so much every month. Here's what happens. The bank immediately, I mean within minutes of the papers being signed, the local bank sells that mortgage to the Federal Reserve, which gives them cash so they can do it all again with Browns and Greens and everybody else in the community. So the ultimate creditor, the one who provides the money to keep the housing market going, is the government. The housing market is on welfare. The Federal Reserve simply prints the money and hands it out to the banks, currently at almost no interest rate. So the bank is happy, gets this cheap money, turns around and lends it to people who want to buy a house at 3%, 4%, 5%. They've borrowed it at half of 1%. Money for the bank. Lots of houses can be financed, but they're all on welfare. It's government money makes it possible. Here's a second example. The Federal Reserve is now buying what are called corporate bonds. Here's how that works. A company has a problem. It can't pay its workers. It can't sell its output. It has an outmoded technology. Whatever the problem is, here's now the easiest way to solve it. You go to the Federal Reserve, you write out a bond. I want to borrow money at an interest rate of half of 1%. That's the easiest, cheapest way to solve whatever problem your company has, which is why American corporations today are deeper in debt than they have ever been in the history of the country. Who's holding that debt? Who's the creditor? The Federal Reserve. In other words, corporations are all on welfare. They're getting a cheap, just like if you're on Section 8 in this country and you get help with your rent, you're a family in difficulty, you get help. You're a corporation in difficulty, you get help from the Federal Reserve. You can't make fun of the welfare mom anymore because she's the least of the recipients of welfare. It's all the rich corporations and so forth who are living off of the government. It's the failure of private capitalism, you bet. Colossal. But the conservatives will continue to celebrate the private enterprise that isn't there anymore because they're holding, but that's the sign of a collapsing empire.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to make things up that are so completely disconnected from the real world that it really is becoming a matter of time until that disconnect catches up with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, they may think that they can keep going for now, but I think that a lot of people are being radicalized by this moment. We're already seeing a number of wildcat strikes being organized on the ground. A lot more people are joining labor unions or unionizing their workplaces. And then, of course, there's this whole global uprising to defund and abolish the police, who are the protectors of private property and capitalism itself. So what are your thoughts on all of these developments? And what do you think that people should be doing to organize themselves right now to force a change?
Well, for me, these are all straws in the wind. I celebrate them. These are things I have hoped for. I felt were missing. I'm pleased. I am satisfied. I'm inspired. And by the way, it all affects me too. I get invited to places I was never invited to before to speak. I have audiences I didn't know existed. And the level of enthusiasm it's infectious. It keeps people like me going. We wouldn't be able to keep going or talk the way we do if it weren't for the feedback that we're basically getting from people who have figured most of this out in terms of their own lives and their own experiences. I do think there are two things I would point to that are, for me, the biggest stumbling blocks or the biggest tasks we face. One of them, and not necessarily the most important, but one of them is best captured by the word organization. Americans have been bitterly disappointed in organizations of all kinds. We pride ourselves on being isolated loners. We celebrate the loner, the independent, the self-reliant, all of that. And some of that is good stuff. But others of it is kind of fantastical and make-believe. We do depend upon one another, whether we can face it or not. But the sad thing is that the left, and which is very numerous in this country and it's very deep. It's a wonderful community, but it fails to get itself together. It fails to organize. If you get interested in an issue, you have until recently been very, very focused. You want to work on that issue, and you don't want people who are focused on something else that's more important in their lives. And then you have these sterile debates. Who's got the most important issue? Are we oppressed mostly because we have our gender or our sexuality or our skin color or our education? Stop. This is a system that breaks people apart because it's terrified of the possibility of what might happen if a organization of the majority. And I'm an economist, so let me tell you what I think the root of that is. We have an economic system in which in every enterprise, factory, office, store, what do we have? A tiny group of people, the so-called owner of the enterprise, or the board of directors of the corporation, or the major shareholders, whatever you want. This is a tiny group of people, a small minority of all of those who work in that enterprise, in that factory, office, or store. That small group of people make all the key decisions. They decide what gets produced. They decide what technology is used. They decide where the production happens. And they decide what happens with the output. Do you sell it? Who do you sell it to? At what price? What do you do with any profit? All of those decisions are made by a minority. And they are told to the majority, who has to live with it and shut up. Because if you say something, they can also fire you, and then you lose your job and lose your income and lose your chance to advance in your life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a horrible, undemocratic system, and I think it leads to a kind of passivity. It leads to a feeling I can't control anything. Because where you work, that's where you go 5 out of 7 days of the week. That's where you spend most of the waking hours of each of those 5 days. To imagine that that's not going to shape you in a basic way is naive. Of course it will. And it's difficult then to get yourself motivated to be an activist out of the workplace when the workplace is so structured to make you passive, to resign you, to make you accept, because what can you do? The notion I can't change the world starts in the workplace, if not earlier in your family, which often replicate. So I think overcoming this situation, being aware of it so that you can fight it. If the American left, even the size it is now, if it were organized, its impact on our society, its power would be 50 times what it is now. Bernie Sanders would have been the candidate, not Joe Biden, and so on, and so on, and so on. So that's the first. And the second one is, and I know being an academic, this may be hard to swallow, and maybe that's why I believe it. It does make sense to study and learn and to have a strategy and to have a theory about what's going on. Otherwise, you're helter-skelter every which way. It's not that you have to believe the theory answers all the questions. No theory does, and if a theory pretends, don't pay attention to it. But a theory is a guide, a rough guide to what to do. And for me, the biggest thing right now is to understand that capitalism, the system, is the problem, that we are not going to fix it or improve it or perfect it or get rid of this or that impediment. We've been there. We've tried all of that. It doesn't work. That's why we're in the disaster we're in. And it's time to face, and this is a theoretical point, that the system is the problem and that system change is the solution. And that change has to happen in our personal relationships, in our workplaces, in our residences, all over the place. That's what system change means. I know it's scary, but not to change the system is proving to be scarier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about, I guess, the end of capitalism, right? So I feel like even before COVID-19 hit, the contradictions of capitalism have never been so pronounced, right? Between, decades of outsourcing and automation and the global environmental crisis, it seems like we just don't have anywhere else to go. However, capitalism just has always been so resilient and able to turn what would be externalities into, new avenues for profit, et cetera. So do you see ways that capitalism can hold on despite these worsening contradictions? And do you see it living out the century?
Great questions. I just wish we had 50 hours more to work our way through. Look, I understand. There's a joke that used to be made about Marxist economists. The joke went like this. Marxist economists have predicted 10 of the last 4 recessions. The answer being Marxists keep seeing the end of capitalism and it doesn't show up. Look, I'm not a predictor. I don't believe in prediction. I can't tell you when this system will disappear. But I don't feel I have to prove that it will. And here's the reason. Every system before capitalism displays the following pattern. It's born, it evolves over time, and then it dies and passes away. We had slavery, it was born, it developed, it died. We had feudalism, born, developed, died. We have capitalism, born, developed. What's the next step? But for me, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when and how. And I'm for the first time, because I haven't felt this way before, I am now looking at a system I don't see how it gets out of the dead end it has waltzed itself into. In this country in particular, Western Europe, North America, Japan, I think capitalism is exhausted here. Not in Brazil, not in India, not in China. They still have a ways to go because they were late to the party. But we were the early ones, and we the capitalist initial parts of the world, we can't solve our problems anymore. That's what's showing up. We can't keep ourselves healthy. We can't prevent our forests from burning down. We cannot solve our racial difficulties. We cannot solve, our misogynistic history. We can't deal with the problems that we have. And that's a sign of a system that's exhausted. And I see the signs around me. And so I'm beginning now to think in an ongoing way that we are in a declining system which is difficult to face up to. It's hard to go through. The last century have seen the British people still unable to understand that their empire is over, acting as if they were something other than a small, cold, wet island off of the mainland of Europe. I mean, that's hard. I understand that. We're going to have the same difficulty. And I see Trump and the horrors of what he represents as a symptom of a declining system raging against the world. This morning, the World Trade Organization reached a conclusion that the tariffs Mr. Trump imposed on China are illegal, contrary to World Trade Organization, and have to stop. Mm-hmm. Look at that. There he was, Mr. Rageful, punishing the world with tariffs. All it did was unify the rest of the world against the United States. These are the ragings of a person who can't effectively accept that the game is coming to an end, and we have to adjust to play a role in the world that is something other than King of the Hill that we believed before. That, I think, is the real challenge of how to manage this decline so it doesn't take us all down with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm conscious of your time. Do you have any time for any more questions, or are we at our limit?
If I could make a suggestion, Mexie.
Yeah.
I don't today because I have other media commitments, but I would be glad in some future time to work out with you to come back and continue the conversation.
Beautiful. That would be amazing. Yeah, I have plenty more to talk to you about. So Thank you so much for coming today. Thanks to everyone in the chat for coming out as well. And just everyone go check out Democracy at Work. And just thank you so much.
Thank you, Mexie. And I really meant it. Let's arrange it and do it again.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.